Greetings and welcome. Thank you to each and every listener for joining us today for my podcast on What Brings You In. My name is Bradley Wenk, and I am an aspiring mental health counselor here to promote mental health awareness, discuss mental health topics, and spread some positive energy. Today, we will be discussing mental health and how it correlates to grief and loss. The concept of life can be quite the complexity to consider. For as many pleasurable and joyful moments as we experience in life, inevitably, there will also be times of sorrow, grief, and loss. It would be quite difficult to go through life and not lose someone who is close to us. When someone is grief stricken, our entire world can seem like a dark and scary place. One minute we are living our lives and going about our day to day, and suddenly someone who we have known our entire lives or someone we rely on for stability, support, and essentially our own wellness can be gone. So, how do we work through these somber moments in life? What keeps us going when there seems to be nothing left to hold on to? As always, before we get started, the views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely the views of those individuals involved and by no means represent absolute facts. Opinions expressed by the host and guests can change at any time. At times, this podcast may cover sensitive topics, and we ask you refrain from listening if you are likely to be offended or adversely impacted by any of these topics. Neither the company, the producer, the host, nor the guest shall at any time be liable for the content covered causing offense, distress, or any other reaction. I am not a licensed mental health counselor, and this podcast should not be used to substitute for actual mental health support. So I do fully intend for this to be a heavier episode, but I know it is important to have these discussions and ultimately try to use what we know about mental health to our advantage. Because though mental health will never be a cure-all for making our pain completely go away, it can be a tool to navigate us through our grief. And as we will get to many times with grief, it's not about not feeling the hurt, but learning how to live with the sorrow while honoring our own lives and respecting those who have passed and how they have influenced and impacted our journey. My guest today is Carrie Johnson, who currently works alongside myself at Parlor House Bistro in Dunedin, Florida. To me, Carrie has lived quite a nomadic life, if you will. She is a type of person who lives life to the fullest. She doesn't take one moment for granted. She is the type of person who sees the world for what it is, and she knows experiencing the world is the only real way to do this. In fact, for many years, Carrie and her husband have split their time between their summers in Alaska, working in the hospitality and tourism industry, and then they come back to Florida and reside here during the off seasons or the colder months for the rest of the country. As a friend, I must say I have always appreciated the positive outlook Carrie has. Working together in the restaurant, I see her every day using her logic and problem-solving skills while maintaining her poise and her upbeat demeanor. Carrie has of recent, unfortunately, lost her father. And naturally, I have shared the process of this podcast with my coworkers at Parlor House. And when I was designing the layout of the episodes, Carrie was more than willing to participate and graciously offered to tell us her story of grief and loss with the hopes of having other listeners who are out there to relate to her story and hopefully offer a hand of support for those who are working through their own loss. So, Carrie, thank you for being here today. I'm so glad to have you with me.
Happy to be with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And before we dive in, I know I did mention this is likely going to be a heavier episode, but yeah, as you'll probably see between Carrie and I, we have a way of kind of bringing some humor into what we discuss. And we just want to say this is not by any means of us using humor as a deflection tool. We're just using this as a way to communicate because it is going to be subjective to everybody who's experiencing their own mental health journey. So, Carrie, just so listeners can be on the same page, could you tell us what you're willing to share about the story of your father's passing?
I'm willing to share any details or answer any questions. I don't really have any. It's an open book for me.
Right. So, could you tell us about how things transpired with your dad?
So I knew that he had cancer, but I didn't know really how bad it was, and I think fair amount of denial went into this from all parties involved.
Right.
Until it just kind of got the best of all of us.
Right. So it was very sudden when you learned?
Yes and no. Like I knew it was coming, but then like 3 days prior, they were saying that he was the healthiest patient on that floor. And so it goes from that until now he's going home to hospice care and then the very next day.
And then the next day, so it was a very quick transition.
is when we lost him. Yeah.
Right. And how long ago was that?
2.5 years.
2.5 years ago? Yeah. So we're still, and it's important to know because as we will get to with certain things in grief and with loss, everyone's, again, subjectivity is very important because it's not going to be a one way or a one grief fits all type of situation. There's a couple of different things with some psych aspects that we're going to get into with that. But can you remember how it felt kind of immediately after you learned about your father's passing?
Well, I was there, but immediate acceptance, just like, well, that's, it is what it is.
Hmm.
And my father's family has the Scandinavian, like, almost seemingly callous
Hmm.
perspective to it, but it's so matter of fact, just like,
Okay.
well, death is just a part of life. It happens when it happens. What do what can you do?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So,
So you're
so the Johnson in me immediately had that reaction, and it
um
took a while, and I think shock.
yeah, shock at
It takes a
first.
minute to accept that, like, this is real.
Yeah,
This is happening to you.
right. And you also had a situation where you do not live in the same state as what your father was living.
No,
So you were in Florida at the time?
I lived in Florida at the time, and both of my sisters also came in from out of town. So we met up in Maryland,
Mhm.
and then happened to be there,
Mhm.
fortunately,
Wow, when it
for
when
the
it
yeah,
happened. Well,
yeah.
it's good that you were there, and sorry, I don't think I've said that. I am sorry for your loss. I know I've said that to you a million times, but, with
No, that's
on
fair. Yeah.
in the conversations that we are having, I know what we are getting to with this, and the reason I bring that up about the different areas of the country, that's just another added level of stress that does happen when
Oh,
somebody.
absolutely. I during that time, I was in the middle of moving.
Oh,
I was like my household. So,
oh,
yeah.
yeah,
So my
yeah,
husband and my stepson had to do all of that by themselves, and it didn't go smoothly.
right, right, it didn't make
So, not at all. There were
yeah,
a lot of factors that went into it, and I was busy trying to buy a washer and dryer online, like, in the middle of all of this.
right,
There was a payment or something that the realtor lady had missed, and so she called me while I was at the funeral home, like, picking out an urn to put
right,
ashes in,
right,
and was like, "I'm gonna need you to give us, like, however many, whatever, however much
right,
more."
right.
I'm like, "Right now?
Yeah.
Can we
This isn't the
seriously?"
best time to
Yeah.
have that kinda
It was
conversation.
a whole
Right.
fiasco. They called me because they couldn't get in touch with my husband. They had
Oh,
to
yeah.
just a whole yeah,
Right, right, and then
disaster.
well, and then even just traveling on top of that, how many times I think a lot of people have probably been there where you get on a plane, you finally get to your destination, but we don't realize what traveling can take out of us, and then I feel like everybody gets sick or there's the sniffles or there's the this or the that, and then on top of your grief and your mourning, because at that point, it's a very, very new concept to be kind of considering the shock is maybe not even worn off yet. So those first couple of days after somebody does pass away are very stressful to begin with, but I can see how that would have transpired with everything else that went into it.
It's an emotional time for sure, and you never know how you're going to react to it. You don't
Yeah,
know what situation will bring what emotional reaction from you.
right.
It's a real roller coaster
It is a
for a
roller
while,
coaster.
and
Right.
the story about the airport.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, there
Whew.
is something to be said too about the way that other people kind of respond when people are grieving, because you never know with that either. You want to share that story? It's yeah,
Yeah, these are good things to know so
right,
that you don't find yourself in this situation. There's paperwork that they give you at the funeral home that says that what you were carrying in this urn is human remains. It has a name on it, it's a whole thing. You give that to TSA, but the TSA agent that I encountered didn't really bother to read that or look at it and
mm,
instead turned the urn upside down and shook it
oh yeah,
and then tried to open it.
uh huh,
And so my sister's losing it and she's very upset and like
yeah, yeah,
shaking.
yeah,
And then I'm getting like mad in her defense, but trying not to, yell at TSA because
right,
that's not going to help me at all.
right,
It turned into a whole big thing. A supervisor had to come over and take control. She was awesome. She was fantastic.
yeah,
I had to yell at somebody in that
right,
situation because
yeah,
emotionally charged. And so what I yelled at him was, I hope if you ever find yourself in this situation, that somebody is way nicer to you.
yeah. that's that's the nicest
And I
way
was
of
like,
yelling at somebody.
yeah, yeah. As I got it out of my system. I had to give him a good hard like
yeah,
talking to, but
yeah.
And then I asked the supervisor to give him some sensitivity training because I don't
Yeah.
want him to put anyone else through that. And
Right. I
just
mean,
like, come
just
on, man.
do you think he did not know what it was
I don't.
or
He didn't believe what it was, and then like my
oh,
sister's voice was literally shaking, and she's like,
right.
"Please do not open that, do not
Yeah.
open that." And he's like,
Yeah.
"Ma'am, you need to step back and just let me do my job." I'm
Yeah.
like, I think you need to step back
Right, right,
in
right,
this
right.
scenario." And that's
Right.
when supervisor came over and was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa,
Gotcha.
whoa, whoa."
What's going on
She
here?
sent him on a quick 15-minute break.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, yeah, because some people just they don't know what it's like to empathize with other people who are going through their own, their own shit,
He's
you
just
know?
dealing with, like, he's pushing people through with a cattle prod, basically.
Right,
Like, "I
right.
don't have time for
And
your
being,
nonsense," and whatever, and I'm like, there's a letter," and I wasn't even able to formulate sentences properly
right,
because I was
right.
already just, uh, physically
Hmm.
exhausted because 'cause I'd been awake for days.
Right.
And then, add on the emotional whatever, and then travel on top of that is yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot, it's a lot, it's a lot, and so you have to steel yourself to be ready for anyone at any time to not care. They don't
Right.
care. They've got their own thing going on, like, people die every
Yeah.
day, like, whatever, lady, just get out of the line,
Yeah.
like, nobody
There's,
cares, and
yeah,
that's
that's what they're
in
getting
the
at. Yeah.
moment, they're not there,
Yeah.
they're just there to do their job.
Right. Especially too, like when you're out of, like when you're not in that environment, I mean, depending on how you did your services or how you did, I mean, in those environments, people will be supportive, but the outside world, it is one of those things. People are still
As
going
soon as
around
you
with their
step
day
outside of that
and
immediate situation, everyone's already back to their, like,
yeah,
daily life.
and
They were the whole time,
that's
like,
what they're doing.
right.
Yeah. So I think that is important to say, like, if you are, just, you never know what somebody's going through. We know this, I mean, I could never imagine doing what that TSA agent did. I mean, I think he maybe lacked a little foundation of human services, if you will.
I
But
think he gets it now.
yeah, I think now that's what we're hoping. But so you do mention that you had your sisters during that time. Did you have what was your support unit like?
So when I was there at the house, my father's wife was there, and then both of my sisters. And we fortunately kind of naturally fell into our own roles. And so one of my sisters made sure we all ate and
Right,
took time to do that
right.
and handled that part of it. The other one made sure that we spent time with dad and
Mm,
had conversations and went
mm-hmm,
in, shifts kind of to have
mm-hmm.
some one-on-one time and say what you wanted to say, which was crucial because
Right.
I was avoiding that. And
Mm-hmm,
so she was
mm-hmm.
the one to kind of enforce, like, you need to go say what you'd like to say, what's on your mind. And so she was good with that, with the emotional part of it. My dad's wife kept, all manner of all things medical involved. And then I handled the medication part of it.
Oh, okay.
So, like, the whole chart of
Mm,
what to take and when
mm-hmm.
and, all of that, that fell on me, and we didn't discuss it.
Right,
It just happened that way.
right, right. So you just kind of fell into your
We just
natural
yep, whatever
family
we're
unit.
best at, what
Right,
we do, I just went home and went back to their house and made a chart.
right, right.
And so we worked together kind of brilliantly in that aspect. I'm so, so, so grateful for that.
Mm-hmm,
I don't know
mm-hmm.
how. I don't
Yeah,
know how people do it
yeah.
that is not their
When that's not
situation.
what they have. Well, a lot of times there's outside resources they have to depend on, and especially like if there is no other family, it would be, we all say like if you don't have the most supportive family, sometimes you make your own family. So hopefully they had, there's support units in those sense. But it is difficult. I mean, this is and there's no script for what to do. There's no real way of knowing how to do something after the loss is experienced. So it's yeah, it's tough.
Everyone's just kind of numb, and family absolutely is meant in the sense that your closest friends are your family.
Right.
And, when you come together in this kind of situation, it's it's surprising to learn how
Yeah.
resilient
Right.
people can be and
Well,
how
and
well they can work together if you
right.
just let your natural roles happen
Yeah. Yeah.
and support each other
Yeah.
and, you know,
And that's how it goes. I
know
mean, and
when
I get
someone needs a
that.
minute to step away, know when someone
Right.
needs a hug
Right.
and
Well, I come from a big family, and actually on both sides of the family, they're kind of split up. And when there is a death, though, you do kind of see how people do come together. I mean, it all of a sudden it's, one who had people who haven't spoken years are now offering support, and at least it's something. You know what I mean? It's not gonna go heal wounds from however long ago, but it is. I think if there is any sort of silver lining, there is always some sort of camaraderie that does come from loss. And it's not the way that we would want to experience it, but it is something that does come from and something to be aware of, especially. And it's funny because I mean, I've talked about it on this podcast before. We don't know who the audience really is yet. We don't know if there is an audience out there. And we've always said we don't care if it helps one person or 40,000 people. I mean, because there could be somebody who's listening who's never experienced a big loss before, or somebody who's experienced multiple, and just kind of helping to guide sort of along certain things from your perspective, but then also from the mental health perspective of certain things that we can do. So with that, was losing your father like one of the biggest losses that you've had, or have you lost anybody else?
No, for sure. When I was 9, I lost my nana, and that was the first, like, big hit for me
Gotcha.
as a kid, and then my grandpa died just about a year and a half later.
Okay.
So that was kind of a huge hit for a child,
Right.
but it's it's very different
Right.
when
Well, and I
you're
personally,
losing a parent.
that's what I was just gonna say. I've lost all of my grandparents, but I have not lost a parent, and I've been told from people. I mean, that is a very, and it doesn't matter really what your age is. I mean, when you lose a parent,
This is something that almost everyone is going to deal with.
right, right.
At some point or another, it's,
Unfortunately, yeah,
quote unquote normal for you to lose your parents within
right.
your lifetime. Typically, you kind of expect that it'll be later in your life and
Always
later
expect
in
it
their
probably to be
lives.
later. Yeah.
So, right. So I just turned 40
Hmm.
and my dad was 60. And so that
Yeah.
just seemed like
Yeah.
not yet. Cause
Right.
he's only 60.
Right.
So what? No.
Right. And yeah, and that's not supposed to be happening right now.
Right.
But it's never gonna, and there's never gonna be a time where that's gonna feel like it's the right age. And that's always kind of that bargaining that kind of comes with death.
Oh yeah. I mean, you're never going to be ready.
Right, right. And that's just the reality of
Yeah.
it. So have you, or how would you say you managed your grief during, like, your initial grief during that time?
I thought I was doing a great job, and then it just kind of plummeted, like,
Mm.
out of nowhere.
Mhm.
Like, the depression part, like, super duper set in, and I went to some crazy dark places,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's a very real thing that I had never experienced before
Yeah. Yeah.
and didn't, I let I'm a planner.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I like to know things are coming, and that was out of left field for me.
Right.
Never
Right.
had experienced that in my life, and
Have you
so
ever experienced depression before that?
no.
No,
It
nothing.
runs rampant in my family,
Okay.
but I've managed to evade it thus far. I haven't had real depression,
Gotcha.
We
Gotcha.
all go down into the doldrums from time to time, but
Mhm.
not a lasting thing
Yeah. Yeah.
or anything that has required for me medication to
Yeah.
step up and out of the
Right.
situation.
Right.
I've been fortunate in
Yeah.
that sense that I haven't had to deal with actual depression. So when I did,
Mhm.
ill prepared and didn't
Yeah.
recognize the obvious signs
Yeah.
and did not know what to
Well,
do.
that's what I was gonna ask was, did you realize it was depression when you were in
Absolutely
it?
not. No, I had no
Right.
idea.
Could you describe it for somebody who's maybe never understood?
I didn't want to kill myself, but I didn't want to be around anymore.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
And
Yeah.
so somehow, like, those things both made sense in my
Mhm.
brain at that
Mhm.
time. My husband was very concerned.
Right. Right.
And this is how it came to the point where I called the suicide hotline multiple times.
Yeah.
And also when I learned that usually they don't answer.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a huge issue right now. And I mean, even on this podcast, I do give a resource at the end of it. And,
Yeah,
and
please. Thank
I
you.
tell people, there is somebody who will be there. And what the reality is that there may not always be somebody there right away. And it's bad. I mean, there is a shortage of counselors right now. There is a shortage of people who are working in the human services field. And I'm not saying that's okay. I think that's definitely something we need to fix, because when somebody gets to that point where they do need the help, that's a hard call to make. And then to not have somebody there, what do you think that kind of does for individuals who are in need? So,
Right. I'm sitting here nodding, thinking like about like sitting in the dark bathroom in like
yeah,
a bathrobe by myself in the dark, just
right.
calling the suicide hotline. And it just rings and rings, and like to the point that like I just started snickering.
Yeah,
Like,
because
Jesus,
I mean, at
like,
least you were able to find kind of
yeah,
that moment
like I
there
can't.
of
What?
Right, right. This is not how this is supposed to work.
No, I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure that they're supposed to, like, answer and help you out, talk you out of stuff,
Right, right,
whatever they do.
right. Yeah, well
Eventually, I did reach somebody, and then they were supremely unhelpful.
mm,
We're like, "Well, I mean, you're not okay, so you're, like, not in you said you don't wanna kill yourself, like, right now." And it was like, "Well, no, but I just, like, feel like I just maybe need some resources for, like, someone to talk to." And they're like, "Okay, well, there's not like, if you're not gonna kill yourself, like, there's not a whole lot that I can do for you." I'm like,
right, like, you almost feel like you should say that you were just to see but then you wherever that's gonna go from there.
Right. Like, what an
Yeah.
insane conversation with someone on the suicide hotline. Like, you pull your phone away and just, like, look at it. Like, "What, for real?"
Right, like,
Like,
this is what I'm doing right now, and
"Alright."
this is
Like,
what's
"There's not a
happening.
whole lot I can do for you." Cool.
So
Alright, so I guess I'll pick up these pieces and move on.
right. Well, did you ever and I think I did ask you this, I don't quite remember. Have you ever gone into counseling before, or have you ever had a counselor or therapist?
I had a therapist, once upon a time who I had a couple sessions with, but she basically told me that she couldn't help me.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
and that was okay, I do remember that, that's right, you did
Yeah.
tell me that. So, well, and the reason why I bring this up, and I'm very honest with my guests before they come on here, I'm like, "You don't have to have had a good, counseling experience to be on here. We're not here trying to fluff anything." I mean, the reality is some people do go to counseling, and it's not a good experience, and that turns them off from going to counseling further. And it's the importance we do talk about it in an episode with a counselor. We talk about the importance of finding a good counselor and finding the good or the best fit that you can, because I feel so bad for you in that situation when you were sitting there in the bathroom. And because the reality is, if you had a good counselor, you could have definitely those are moments where you reach out to your counselor. Doesn't really matter what time of day it is. It doesn't matter what's going on. And even just to have that one person there right in that moment that can say, "Hey, I hear your feelings. Your feelings are valid. I'm here. Let's talk." Because that's the only thing you can really do unless you do need further assistance. And at that point, that would be on the counselor. But still, that's a resource that could be right there when you do need it. Um, and I am very sorry that you went through that. I mean, and as somebody who works in this field, who's passionate about this field, this is not something we need to be having happen.
Right. That's a lot of that is on me, though, for not seeking out a different counselor when I had a not so great experience, knowing now after talking to you so many times about the
Hmm.
topic,
Yeah.
I know that what I should have done was just go to a different counselor.
Right.
But instead, I was like, "Well, all right, well, I guess counseling's not for me."
Well, and
And
that's important.
that's what happens too.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
and we've
Because
talked that was
yep.
my own experience with it. Now I work in this field, I mean,
Right.
it happens very, very quickly where you have that bad experience. And we work in a restaurant, what do we always say? We say for every good experience, your guest is gonna tell one person,
Oh
right?
yeah.
"Oh, hey, I had a great meal at Parlor House." They're gonna tell their friend. They had a horrible meal, they're gonna tell 10 people, right?
Absolutely.
So there is that stigma right there that says, hey, in counseling, we see it all the time, especially culturally. We see a lot of different cultures that don't really believe in counseling anyway. They kind of go in with bad attitudes. And as soon as they get that one little piece of validation that this is quack, this doesn't work for me, then they're telling all of their friends, they're just reinforcing this notion that counseling is not good. So it's very easy to fall into that statistics of people. I did it. We both did it. We're both part of that statistic of people that had a bad counseling experience and said, you know what, counseling's just not for me. And that's why I'm bringing it up again, just because I really want to reinforce out there. I mean, I know right now counselors are busy. It's very hard to get in with a good vetted counselor. But once you do, it can be a matter of life or death in some situations.
I should have sought out a counselor
Yeah.
to
Well,
help me
and
through that situation. It wasn't that, other people who care about me in my life didn't suggest it.
right.
I just don't like addressing feelings.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. And that's
that's
kind of what therapy is about. So that would be a very
okay,
difficult.
mustn't have that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a big part of it.
I totally understand that. I get it.
And
And
denial was, again, the most prevalent part of it, and the stages of grief. And that's
yeah,
not
yeah.
not to
We're
delve
gonna
into that. We're going to
we'll
delve
get
into
into that.
that.
Yeah,
All
but
right. Yeah.
before we get into, there's one thing. I do want to ask too, or I think I want to. I know you told me. Well, how did you celebrate your father after his passing? Because you guys did
We were like
something.
in like the midst of COVID times, like
Oh, that's
right
right.
smack dab at the more towards the beginning, not in the middle,
Okay,
but yeah. So
but did you want to share when you spread? You spread his
Oh,
ashes,
yeah.
right?
Several. The first time it was all like I was, all emotional about it. I carried his ashes around with me in a backpack around Alaska for like months, trying to
Mhm.
find just the right spot and just the right time and whatever.
Mhm.
Finally, I found a spot and had myself a good old cry and an
Yeah.
emotional moment or whatever. And then the second time, I was in the middle of a river. I had, like, climbed out there and was having this moment of reflection, and the dogs who were hiking with us just came, like, crashing through the river and covered me with water and a whole bunch of water, like, just shook off.
Right. So, yeah,
Water
so if you
straight
can
into the urn.
okay, gotcha,
Into the
gotcha.
urn. I dropped the cap into the water, and then, like, all I could do was cackle in that situation. Like, "Oh, well,
There's
sorry, dad."
yeah,
Like, I
but
go whoops.
here you
Dry it off on your sleeve and put it back
yeah,
on. So what I discovered from that is that if you get ashes in even, like, remotely kind of wet, they kinda cement together.
okay,
Right,
gotcha,
so now I keep
gotcha.
tweezers in the little container with ashes so I can pull out I know, I
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
The fact that
yeah.
I've become so, like, casual about this is fantastic. It means I've come a long way. So by the end of
Right,
it, this summer in Alaska, this past year, I was spreading ashes all over the place. Like,
right,
"Oh, this is
right.
our cool lunch rock," where I would have
Gotcha,
brought him had he
gotcha.
been able to come, but he always wanted to go to
Okay,
Alaska, and he didn't have the opportunity before he got too sick.
gotcha.
And so I decided, you know what? I'm just gonna bring dad my backpack everywhere, and if I see a cool spot, we're gonna put some ashes there because I would
Gotcha.
have brought him here anyway.
Right,
So
right.
now he's been.
Well, that's a neat way of honoring him,
Yeah.
I mean, and, I feel like and especially when it comes to after death services, I mean, everyone is different, and so if that's some especially, like, if that's something your dad would have wanted, then I think that's
I
a
think ultimately probably wouldn't have wanted or found necessary a full-on funeral and the
mhm,
official ceremony. We couldn't do anything because of COVID. So
right,
it was just my dad's wife and my sisters and me kind of quarantined in that house.
mhm,
And then we headed on to our separate ways or whatever. And so we,
right,
about a year and a half later, were finally able to convene at Yosemite
right,
and did the official first ashes spreading there with the large urn.
gotcha, gotcha,
Another thing to note that people don't tell you about spreading ashes. We like leaned over a waterfall
right.
at the top of a mountain in Yosemite. It was breezy up there, and we all, like, every last one of us got covered in ashes, like,
Oh,
as we were trying to
as
right,
you're trying to
right, and
spread.
so you can't, like, brush it off, and so we all just kinda looked at each other and just walked around covered in ashes for the rest of the day
Well, it is a
because
little different, right? It's because it's decomposing.
yeah, it was a
It's
chemical
a
process that
chemical,
they
yeah,
use now,
yeah,
and
yeah,
brings me back to yet another point
yeah.
of things that people don't tell you that they should or maybe shouldn't, I don't know. The lady at the funeral home gave me so much detail about the
Mm,
process
yeah, things that
of
you
how it's not like yeah, so I knew that it was gonna be a cremation, I didn't know it was a chemical process.
right,
She told me, like, a lot about what goes down, and I'm like, "Can you
right,
stop talking? Like, why I didn't ask for any of this information. This is what
yeah,
I don't wanna think about that."
yeah, yeah.
Like,
It's
dude,
right,
like, come
especially
on.
when it's so fresh and things
Oh,
are
yeah, I did, like,
now now
2 days, and then she's
yeah,
just busy telling me, like, how the breakdown goes. Like, I didn't
right, and I've met people in general who are kind of uncomfortable with the idea of cremation to begin with.
yeah.
So, I mean, there's some sort of I mean, again, sensitivity training, I mean, that's kind of a common
I know that
notion
she
here,
deals
like
with it every day, so you can become desensitized to that if
right,
you
right.
are you own a funeral home.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is, like,
this is
old
what you
news for
do
you,
every day.
but, yeah,
Yeah,
not only is the whole entire concept new for me, but, like, as my dad, like,
yeah,
can you not?
right, there's things that we don't
I
need
don't wanna
to
know. I didn't
know.
wanna know that. I
Yeah,
didn't ask.
yeah, and I feel like if you just said that did you tell her that? Like, did you tell her, like, "Hey, this is something" like, "I appreciate you explaining the process,
No,
but"
because it took an entire Xanax before I went,
right,
so
right, so you were in a
I
place
wasn't
of
really able to say much of anything, yeah.
gotcha,
I
gotcha.
had also my first, like, not panic attack by any means whatsoever, like,
Mhm,
I didn't think I was having a heart attack or I was gonna die, but it didn't feel right and had, like, super
mhm,
anxiety,
mhm,
super crazy anxiety,
mhm.
and, like, freaked out, like, hyperventilating breathing
Right.
before we went to the funeral home, so my sister gave me a Xanax about it, and
Yeah,
off we went.
yeah, yeah.
And then later I fell asleep in the lady's office while she was talking about some kind, I don't know.
Right. Well, you were in your grieving process and doing what you had to do.
Yep.
So I do want to, in the same way that we are talking about, a heavier topic today, but we do like to keep positive spins on things here, and so what is something about your dad that you will always remember?
Think about the right one that I want to say. I mean, everything. Like, he
Yeah.
was so cool.
Yeah.
I wish for you that you'd met him.
I know. I know.
What was the question again?
Just, what's something that you're always gonna, what is something you're always gonna remember about him, or like it's something really that just makes you happy when you think about him?
Oh, his smile. I got to make him smile a lot.
Oh, oh. Well, I'm glad that you had that. That's very special.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I love that. And, I don't want to make us too heavy. I'm trying to make this more, and and this is a great example. It's very hard to do that when we reflect and we talk and
Yep.
we get into it. But I mean, he led a very interesting life from what you have told me about him. So,
Absolutely.
and I want to get into it. We were briefly mentioned the stages of grief, which is one of those things that is important because I do think in psychology, I think it's safe to say most people are somewhat familiar with what the stages of grief are, mostly because they have been kind of brought mainstream. So it was introduced by Kubler Ross, and the stages of grief. Really, I mean, I noticed it was even in a comedy show that I watched. Like it was in New Girl. I don't know if you ever watched that, but Schmidt's ex-lover was having a breast reduction. So he went through the stages of grief over what he was considering that to be a loss. But what was funny about it, and I mean, from like my psych perspective, I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my God, it doesn't work like that. Um, just to say them in order, the stages of grief are denial, followed by anger, then bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. But I know you probably had a few things to say about the stages of grief, right?
Yeah. I knew what they were and thought that I was doing such a great job by recognizing
Yeah,
each stage as it happened. I knew that they weren't necessarily going to happen in order
right.
that they're listed on a piece of paper. So I was like, oh, that's this one. This came first. But what I did not know and did not see coming is that they keep happening.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
circles back around again. So I'm like, all right, denial definitely covered that one real hard. And then, you get to the acceptance phase and I'm like, all right, checked off all the boxes, on we go. Like, and then it just, yeah, out of nowhere.
right.
I'm
And then
unloading the
you go
dishwasher
back to
by
the next
myself at
one.
home and all of a sudden I'm like bawling and having
Yeah,
myself a good full on depressed moment. And I'm
yeah.
like, what?
Like I thought I already went through
We
this, and
covered this already.
as
Like,
somebody
what?
who is a planner, you're like, okay, let's
Yeah,
probably just get it done, right?
right.
Like, let's just go through them. We'll be said and over with,
Yes,
and
not that I was, like, eager to get it over with, so to speak, but I
mhm,
just, I wanted to have covered each stage and
mhm,
dealt with
and
it and processed it
right
so that I can move on with my life.
to the next, right,
Yeah,
and
it
keep
doesn't
doing what
stop.
you
It
need to
just
do,
keeps happening over and over again at unexpected times, and I
right.
was not ready for that.
Well, it is important for people that don't know. So when Kubler Ross wrote those, she wrote them in her book on death and dying. And this was after years of working with terminally ill patients. So much of what was described in the stages of grief were actually from the perspective of one knowing their own death or knowing their own mortality. So over the years, though, they have adapted. And now we see that these stages are also being used for other individuals and how they would experience someone that they are losing. So it is funny how they've kind of turned into what they are, but in general, because even the most generalized, recognized feelings within the stages of grief are still emptiness, sorrow, anger, and withdrawal, which are all things that you're likely to experience when you are grieving. And there is also an important note that there is a difference between grief, which is kind of that sudden instant what you're feeling, like the waves of grief that will come over you, versus grieving, which is the process of doing so. So we're always kind of keeping that in mind. And just for people who do think kind of maybe the way that you did, Carrie, like how, oh, it's just going to be, you're going to go from this one to that one. It's not. You're going to go like you said. And I think like you even said it. You said that right after your father had passed, you had said you felt the acceptance, that part, that Johnson part that came into you that was like,
Immediately, it was
right,
just like, well, this is, what happened.
right.
And so,
Right, and some people will do that. They'll start with the acceptance, and then
sure.
they'll go through different stages later. And there are also, I know there are people that have asked before in different, like, I've sat in on, in my schooling and stuff, sitting in on sessions, and people will ask, like, well, I didn't go through the stages of grief. Like, is there something wrong with me, or like, should I have? And again, it does not matter. Whatever you feel when you're going through this is exactly what you're supposed to be feeling. So kind of too, when I was saying with the sitting in on counseling sessions and so on, one of the things that people will ask is, as we navigate through the steps of grief, how do we help ourselves? And so I wanted to get your perspective on that first. I mean, how were you able to kind of help yourself through the process?
I knew that with time, just
Hmm.
like with anything,
Right.
that I would get back to some sense of normalcy, or, for what for me is considered normal.
Right. Exactly.
Talking to you honestly helped a
Oh,
lot with that. And you saying things like what you are feeling is what you're
you, s-
supposed to be feeling right now, and allow it to happen. And that, I know it sounds so silly, but no one had ever told me that. And
right.
so, like, you made it okay
Oh,
for me to be feeling what I was feeling when I was feeling it.
right.
And I typically tend to eschew feelings.
Well, and that's totally something that, you are allowed to do.
Right.
You are
Like,
allowed to
feelings, lame. Who wants
yeah,
those?
who wants to go over all that?
Yeah.
I mean,
This
so, and
seems boring and like a lot of work. No, thank you.
right, I'm not gonna do that.
Ew.
Oh, right. Yeah,
Feelings.
get
Gross.
away feelings. It's like a fly swatter, just
Yeah, it's
slap it
just a
away.
nuisance more
Oh.
than anything, but you helped me to accept that they're normal and how to accept them, and
Oh,
thank
well,
you for that.
no, of course. I mean, and I just, and that is, again, for anybody that is out there. I mean, and to answer that question from the mental part of it, I mean, it's probably one of the most difficult parts about grief to consider, but like my gut instinct and kind of what I told you is harsh, or to not make it insensitive as what it might seem, but you have to allow yourself the time and a safe place and with the support you need to feel the grief as you feel it, because there is no right or wrong way to grieve someone. So you kind of take each flood of emotion as it comes and eventually work your way through what you're feeling. So, in the most basic of examples that I can think of, grief is kind of like being on a tiny boat in the middle of a violent hurricane. And, there are times where it might feel like you won't make it, or there might be times where like you might feel like you're in the middle of a storm, and the only way to get out though is to keep going. And it doesn't mean that there won't be times where the boat just doesn't move and you're just getting hit. And there doesn't mean that there aren't times that like you want to be Lieutenant Dan and Forrest Gump and just shout angrily into, the water and curse and scream. And there might be times where you're praying to whatever your higher power is and you're pleading for the storm to just not be there at all. But all of these components are the terrifying and sometimes the merciless, but ultimately the inevitable parts of loss, grieving, and living. And, there was one I want to think of. Actually, it was her book. So I can't remember her name. Oh, it was so psychologist Mary Frances O'Connor. She wrote in her book, it's called The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. And she said that grief, it's been said, is the cost of love. The yearning and sadness we feel after someone dies is the price we pay for the close relationships that we treasure. And that's a bitch. You know what I mean? That is so hard to think about. But once you do come to that place of acceptance and you've kind of worked through your grief, I think suddenly there are those times where you're like, you know what? At least I had somebody so close and so important with those memories and with what I will treasure, that I had that. Because imagine not having had that at all.
Right.
And again, it's a bitch. It doesn't make it any easier, but it is. I mean, can you relate? Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think it's worth it to have had the experience of being a part of his life.
Right. And yeah, I'm sorry. I know that's really hard.
I mean, sometimes it just is the biggest kick in the heart, and like to the point where you can't breathe.
Right.
And then most of the time, and with time, then you can reflect on all of the wonderful things. And it does come back around to that.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't feel like it at the time, but
Yeah.
it
And it
does.
doesn't feel like you're gonna get there
All of
any.
the things that people say,
Hmm.
like, just give it time, your heart will heal or whatever. Same with like a breakup,
Right.
all of the cliches and all of the same things that
Yeah.
all your old great aunts told you, like it's all true because
Right.
it's,
Right.
they've been through it, and
Yeah.
it is real. All of the things that people say are for a reason.
Hmm.
It does get better.
Right. And it is.
You
I
will
mean,
be okay.
well, and there is even from the neurocognitive side of it, I mean, when you have a bond with somebody, your brain encodes this bond in the same way, kind of like you said. And loss can be, and we've been talking a lot about the loss of a loved one, but it could be a relationship, it could be the loss of a job, it could be I mean, anything really. So,
Right.
but when you do have that brain structure that's kind of saying over and over, like, this is what this person's associated with, and obviously this is a person or a thing of safety or security. So when that is no longer in this physical world, there does come a point where you need to almost retrain your brain to an extent. And I think that's a lot where, yes, there's the hole in the heart, there's the kick to the gut, there's all of that. But your brain is essentially that's what's filtering that. And eventually you will come to a point where it never, and I'm not trying to be, again, insensitive. I'm not trying to say that you're rewriting somebody out of your life, but it's not the case by any means. You're not getting rid of this person. You're not taking them out of your mind. You're figuring out a way to live without them.
Yes. Yes. And that was another one of those phrases that people use. Like, you don't get over it, you learn how to live with it.
Right.
And it's 100% true.
It's right,
Absolutely.
very accurate.
Yes.
Well, we've said before in a couple of the other episodes, like when people are going through mental health crisis or when they're in distress, the number one thing that you want to make sure that you are doing, you're taking care of your basic needs first. So of course, especially when we're experiencing loss, it's okay to turn to that tub of our favorite ice cream and just sit on the couch and zone out and be with friends or go out for a night to just forget about your troubles. But we can't eat the ice cream every day. And if our grief is starting to get ahead of us, which is what it will likely do, we need to make sure that we're taking the steps that we need to not let that happen, because that is when we'll notice a lot of times when the severity of the situation kind of overtakes, and you can get into a dangerous place. And I know, like you had said, that with your depression it had taken you there. And when you do get to those moments, you have to rely on your support groups. You have to rely on whoever is there that can help you, any of the resources you can find. Hopefully, if you do get to the point of calling the suicide hotline, somebody picks up for you. I mean, that's what we can hope going forward. But there are all of those ways of taking care of yourself, even when it doesn't feel like you should be taking care of yourself. You still need to eat your, nutritious meals. You need to make sure that you're keeping up with your hygiene. You need to make sure that you're finding healthy forms of coping, whether it's walking, writing in a journal, meditating. And I know all of this, and I've said this before, all of this sounds like a bunch of fluff. Like, and I've seen clients come in and they're like, "Ugh, like, this is never going to work." But if it's something that works for you, then keep it and keep it going. I mean, did you have anything to add to that or any?
I think that, like, having other people telling me to do things like drink water
Mhm.
was crucial, because
Right.
you forget
Yeah. Yeah.
that. I mean, like you said, with the hygiene, with all of it. I didn't shower for days.
Yeah.
I was busy.
Yeah.
Like,
Right. Right.
there was no time for that, and
Right.
I didn't wanna be away for
Right.
any given second at
Yeah.
all, and
Yeah.
so,
And it
when
can be one of those things, like, especially the water. I know it sounds so silly, but it's like, wait, I haven't had water
I
in
had
2
to have
days.
someone remind me to drink water.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
because I couldn't remember the
Right.
last time I had drank water.
Right. And we both grew up, I think, in small towns where when somebody passed away, people brought around a hot dish or a
Yes. Oh, yeah,
casserole or
absolutely. Yeah,
I
so
mean,
you don't
and
have to
there
worry about,
right, and
like,
there are
cooking when
reasons
you're in
why that
yeah.
was such a staple, especially in places where it's cold, because it's like you can kind of really get into those
Yes.
harder moments of life. So, and all of these things, we're saying this because they are important to keep yourself kind of on track with getting through the process. And that's what the whole point of this was again, it's different for everybody. It's not easy, but the more that you kind of can keep on task, hopefully the sooner you can get to a place where you are living your life to a new norm that you are willing and able to accept.
I think I'm willing and able to accept more now that I'm on the other side of
Mhm.
this experience.
Mhm.
There are a couple doozies that you're just never gonna be ready for, like, if you're a beneficiary
Mhm.
on any kind of life insurance policy, you have to
Mhm.
fill out forms. And
Yeah.
so, like, just opening the envelope is hard, and then you
Right.
get all the way through filling out the paperwork, and then all the way at the end, you have to fill in that person's name and their date of
Mm.
death, and
Mhm.
to write it on a piece of paper, like,
Right.
that is challenging.
Yeah.
That's the first one that really hit me, like,
Right.
I had to be on the phone
Mhm.
with the the lady
Yeah, the lady, right.
Just to get, I
Yeah.
had to make
Yeah.
it like I'm doing business things and this
Right.
is all it is, because otherwise there was no way. Like my
I've
hand was shaking.
Right, right. I've been with somebody before when they got a call from the hospital because their loved one was an organ donor, and they
Yeah.
had to have that conversation because they were talking about specific things that they needed. So
Right.
that's also
Right.
and in those moments, and again, when it's and I mean, and her reaction was extreme frustration and then anger and then outward projections of anger, and it was understandable. I mean, it was completely like, yeah, you get it, but then her wife was actually there and was kind of talking her down a little bit, and she was like, "This is what she wanted. We have to remember that. We have to go." And those are the things that you never ever want to think about. I'm sure if I brought in, somebody who worked in the medical field who could tell you, I mean, horror stories of how these moments happen directly as somebody or immediately after somebody has passed, it would be a whole new perspective of how you do deal with things,
Yeah.
not making that any easier. But again, just kind of keeping in mind these are some of those harder, more difficult parts of
We've all
grief.
talked about it, we've all heard about it, but when it is you in the situation,
Mhm.
there's suddenly just,
Yeah.
obviously this whole different perspective.
Yeah.
Like
100%.
a lot of light bulbs of
G
like, that's what they like, that's why people always say that.
Yeah.
Or,
Right.
a lot of that came together for me. And
Right.
I didn't need to have that knowledge. I
Yeah.
didn't want to,
Yeah.
but I've
So
got it now.
right, right. There have been studies, and it's interesting because especially because psych is kind of one of those things where, as a science, we do recognize it, but of course, it's not a science that is the same as what it would be to be in another form of, say, biology or whatever you want to say. But there are a lot of connections between spirituality and psychology, and there are studies that have shown that many of us do believe in an afterlife presence of our loved ones, even after they have departed. They still seem to be around us. Do you believe in any of that? Do you feel like your dad's still kind of with you to an extent?
Typically, no, but butterflies for some reason
Mm.
for me, but like the white ones,
Oh, okay.
like mid
Yeah.
afternoon fluttering around like that. Right after he died, there were a bunch of white butterflies in the yard, like
Mhm.
coincidentally
Right.
outside
Right.
of his house in Maryland. And so now when I see white butterflies, I think of him. I'm
Oh,
like,
okay.
oh, hey,
Yeah.
Dad.
I know when my grandfather passed away, on my mom's side, she had a correlation with ducks,
Mhm.
and I don't know what it was. There was just something, and it was always like these ducks that you don't really see all the time. Like, I don't know what species or whatever it was, but it is funny. I think birds are definitely something. I've heard that with so many people. I've
Mhm.
heard like cardinals, or I've heard dragonflies, especially like things that fly. I feel like there's some spiritual kind of connection with those.
Yeah.
Freedom, I think, too, is a big kind of part of that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting.
It's a nice, pleasant thought for me.
Hmm.
And then I found out later that my dad's wife and one of my sisters also see butterflies kind of in that
Oh,
same sense.
okay.
Like, oh, hey,
Oh, right,
hi,
right. Yeah, and
thinking of
there's
you.
also been I've heard of people that have they've they've woken up and their whole bedroom smells like somebody, and especially like if they use, like, I remember some people have correlated, because I still think about it for some reason, like Old Spice, because I think it has such a unique kind of scent to it that they're like, oh my god, my whole room smelled, and that's what so and so wore, or
Right.
that's what reminds me of them. And it is interesting how these kind of seem to pop up, and it does, and I think those are kind of little moments where it reminds you, like, it's a subtle blessing of just, hey, they're still here. And I mean, no matter what we believe, I think we all find comfort in knowing that even though somebody is gone, their presence is still here, and we do honor them, and we still kind of find ways to bring them into our lives even as we do go forward.
Accepting that it's gonna hit me in different ways at different times was hard for me, and I know
Right.
that we've talked about that a lot before. I can see a photograph of my father, and sometimes I'm like, "Oh, what a great Halloween," or whatever, and then
Hmm.
other times I'm, like, completely boohooing on the floor.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's the same photo.
Right. Right.
It
Right.
just
Right. Just
evokes
making
a
you feel
very different
different
reaction
ways.
depending on, my mood, whether or not I've eaten,
Yeah.
whether or not I'm sober.
Yeah.
These are all
Yeah.
factors in that,
Yeah.
but you never know, and so expecting the unexpected is the hardest part, and having someone to talk me through
Hmm.
all of that
Hmm.
would have been really helpful. And
Yeah.
again, it wasn't that other people weren't suggesting that, like,
Yeah.
"You should probably see a counselor." I'm like, "Yeah, I should,"
Hmm.
and then just didn't, and
Right.
so, feel like I would have done myself a solid
Gotcha.
for understanding.
Well, and you know what? It's never too late. And there might still be some things in there. I know feelings are hard to talk about, and I'm not trying to say right now on record that like, oh, maybe you should. And I would say it to anybody. I say it to people who aren't going through grief, people who aren't experiencing. I say it to people who are stressed out from their job. I'm like, you should think about talking to a counselor. So I'm always going to advocate for that. But I just want you to know, like, as you do say, I should have. I mean, it's never too late. And you can't go back and take that away. I mean, you did exactly what you had to do, and you are here today, and that's what's important. And that's what I mean keeps us going. So,
I figured it out, but I worry about, what would have happened if it hadn't struck me as funny
hmm hmm
when the suicide hotline didn't answer.
right, right,
If I'd been in a different
a very
mood
different,
or a different whatever, or
yeah,
hadn't
all
eaten
of it,
enough,
right, right, right,
I could have had a very different reaction to that, and that's
right.
scary.
It is scary. I agree.
So when I say I should have had someone to talk to or should have sought that out for myself,
hmm
that's a good safety net to have for when you're not thinking rationally.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you on that. Well, we're kind of getting to a point of wrapping this up. I have a few more things to kind of add to, but is there anything like in general you'd want to say, or any kind of closing remarks or anything?
Checking my notes. If there's any other bit of advice that I could offer if you are dealing with a situation where you have a terminal illness
hmm
or you know what's coming,
hmm
research the funeral home beforehand.
Okay. Yeah.
Don't wait until afterwards because
hmm
then you're stressed and then you're exhausted
Yeah.
physically and
Yeah.
mentally and not in your right mind.
Right.
All of them, they all suck.
Yeah. Right.
They're all a ripoff. They
Yeah.
all charge way too much for what they offer because they can.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, you're not going to find yourself the best deal, but what
hmm
you are doing is having the peace of mind of having that arranged beforehand so
Right.
you don't have to stress research
Right. What's
funeral
going on? Because that's
homes
going to make it
while
even
your
more
loved one
difficult.
is deceased in the next room. Do
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, don't wait until afterwards.
Yeah. Make sure you get those moments in there. And
It's not easy to do,
right.
but, pour yourself a giant glass of wine or iced tea or whatever gets you through your whatever you need.
Yeah.
And just
And
do
just
it.
get it
Just
done.
Google like
Just
funeral
get it
home and
done.
read the reviews.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Absolutely.
we had a bad one and then we ended up finding a better one. But like, you don't want to do that research and deal with that like after the fact.
No.
It's not fun to do it beforehand because it forces you to think about it.
Right.
Forces you to
Right.
address it. Like, this is something that I'm going to need. I need to research a funeral
Yeah.
home. But I promise you it's way better
Yeah.
to
Right.
do it
Then
beforehand
to avoid
than when you
it.
really need it.
Right. Right. That's a really good piece of advice. I mean, and again, something I would not have thought of if I was
Yeah.
in that situation. Make
Right.
sure that it is
Read
figured
the
out and
reviews for their bedside manner, so to
right.
speak, for how they deal with situations. Because,
Right.
again, they deal with this all day, every day.
Yeah.
So they're
It's nothing
real
new to
matter of
them.
fact about it. They're
Yeah.
not going to sugarcoat things.
Right.
It's like they forget that, like, this is the first time I'm experiencing this.
Right.
Can you maybe ease me into this process a little bit?
better. Yeah.
Yeah.
I understand that. Well, if I just want to say before this does get wrapped up, to anyone who's currently listening and working through their grief, I am so sorry for the loss and for what you are feeling. You are strong and you are capable of riding out this storm. And though the light at the tunnel may seem so far in the distance, you're not sure if you will ever get to the light, just keep going. Take advantage of any of the resources you have available to you. Reach out to those who can help you, whether this is a friend who can listen or a professional who can help guide you. I want you to make sure you try to listen to your grief and don't be afraid to feel the feelings you have, even if they make you feel vulnerable or uncomfortable. Take care of yourself and remember, and I'm willing to bet that whoever is parted would want you to live as happy of a life as you can. So take care of yourself and keep yourself and your wellness in mind as you move forward with your own life. And eventually the light at the tunnel will become brighter. And though your grief may never truly go away, and though you may hate me for saying this, how lucky we are to have had someone in our lives who have meant so much to us, who has taught us so many lessons, and who have created so many beautiful memories with us. And we're able to take that grief in the first place. So to Carrie, I am very, very thankful to have had you here today. I know it's not always easy to talk about and be so open about something this difficult. So I thank you for your bravery and your compassion, your genuine heart. And I know that's really shown through today. I know you've helped somebody. I absolutely have every inkling and every positive feeling about it. So you are a wonderful part of my life, and I have a feeling your dad is very proud of you and for being the person you are.
I hope so. Thank you.
And another big thank you and shout out to the Collab Studios. We are so close to launching, and I'm sure Christina and Tyler are ready for all of my texts to stop coming in with all the questions that I have. But the entire staff here has always been so gracious and helpful, and I could not thank you guys more. And though we have talked about it in this episode, I don't want to discourage anybody from trying. But if anyone that you know or yourself are experiencing a mental health crisis, go to 988lifeline.org, or you can call or text 988. Hopefully, someone will be there to talk to you. And thank you again to all of my listeners for tuning in again. This is an episode of On What Brings You In. I am Bradley Wank, and have a wonderful rest of your day.